Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I'll be with you for the next hour, and we're broadcasting on Yagara and Turrbal country. And well, if you're hearing this, it means I am not in the 4ZZZ studio because I am otherwise occupied in happy news that my wife Beck is either giving birth or has just given birth to my first child, and so I'm taking some weeks off. But so you still get your fill of the Paradigm Shift, I have dug out some classic episodes to re-listen to. And this one, well, it's been a while. We're probably due for a re-listen because I made this radio show in June 2017. And it remains one of my favourite episodes because I indulge in my own personal interest of Brisbane's public art, the sculptures which surround our city. So you'll hear all about that. At the same time as I made this show, as you'll hear, I did make a zine as well, which is still kicking around the place, copies of it, and also you can find it online if you want to read more about Sculptures of Brisbane. And one more thing about this episode that I love is that it features the voice of Chris Cobcroft, one-time music director at 4ZZZ and hosted the New Releases show for many years. Sadly passed away now, but Chris kindly agreed to read a story for me in the making of this show, and so you will hear his voice there too. So anyway, with that said, let's take a trip back in time to 2017. I am very excited about the program that we have, actually. I, for a long time, have been very interested in the public art around Brisbane and especially the sculptures that line our streets. There's quite a lot of them. Some people possibly walk past not noticing often. Sometimes some might catch your eye. Well, I am a big fan of sculptures, and so I'm putting together two things this weekend. One, I've been writing a zine about my favourite sculptures of Brisbane and why I like them. And today we're going to be on the Paradigm Shift talking all about the sculptures of Brisbane. I have a treasure trove of interviews here. I've interviewed Cezary Stulgis, who has done, there's 4 of his sculptures in the CBD actually, varying from the Guardian, the dog carrying the tree in its backpack, the dialogue between a couple on Queen Street. There's the passenger, the train commuter that's at the top of Adelaide Street, and he also did a sort of angelic figure at the Aurora Hotel. So I've interviewed him about his public art. I've interviewed Jeff Rickertt, local Brisbane historian, about some of the significant radical figures that are commemorated in sculpture in Brisbane. I've got a reading of an article by David Frith, famous cricket writer, who in the 1970s wrote an article about tracking down the legendary Aboriginal fast bowler Eddie Gilbert, who is also commemorated in sculpture. And so we've got a reading of that. And I also interviewed Luke Roberts, the artist who created the UFO on the point where Boundary Street and Melbourne Street meet in West End, and also the Poinsettia flower now that has gone up at Emma Miller Place. So all that is coming up. It's going to be very exciting. And let's go into our first interview with Cezary Stulgis, who created a number of the sculptures of Brisbane. Let's hear what he has to say about them. Could you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, my name is Cezary Stulgis. I'm a sculptor artist.
And today we are talking about sculptures of Brisbane, and there are actually quite a few of yours in the CBD. I can think of the Commuter, the top of Adelaide Street, the Guardian on Ann Street, the Naked Couple in Dialogue on Queen Street. Could you maybe go through each of these artworks and tell us what the inspiration was for them?
The Commuter, which is actually the passenger title, was inspired by, I guess, people going to work back and forth, the Lunchbox Joe figure. At that period of time, I just came back from studying over in Europe, and I guess maybe that atmosphere of people commuting and being quite depressed about it, I think, in trams and trains, might have rubbed off. I'm not saying that's the general vibe of what Brisbane commuters are experiencing, but it's more of an overall, I guess, worldly perception, I guess, of that kind of activity.
Yeah, he seems a bit weighed down and exhausted by the grind of going to work each day.
Correct. And I guess he's kind of, and the figure itself is kind of inspired by socialist sculpture. I guess there's elements of, being on a train, being on a bus, being in that sort of confined environment. There's a original bus window with a panel fitted into the back of it to give it that kind of background.
So what about the Dialogue on Queen Street?
Look, I mean, they're all quite different pieces to each other. So, as you can probably tell, they all have a bit of a different atmosphere in general about them. Dialogue was more about an intimate moment between a couple sitting down, wanting to talk to each other, wanting to interact with each other, and somehow being, I guess, shy or restrained about it. I wouldn't call them maybe naked, because it's more about, I guess, figurative, the way figurative work is taught, usually with no clothes on, and understanding, I guess, learning to do the sculpting of the body. And I guess to me, they all almost are clothed in some way. So that hasn't got anything to do with them sort of wanting to interact in any way. They're total strangers to each other. And it's about that moment of wanting to connect with someone, I guess.
Yeah, I always took it because they're not quite facing each other. They're kind of looking away and they seem a bit guarded. I took it as a kind of symbol that even when we're close and maybe even when we're unclothed, like we're still are somewhat restrained in how we relate to each other, constricted or something. Is that near the mark at all?
Yeah, for sure. There's always some sort of moment, some sort of consciousness about yourself and about your space around you. And but I guess it's more about them wanting to talk to each other and wanting to somehow glance at each other and being afraid to or being shy about it. And so the title is Dialogue, but in fact, I guess the dialogue's not necessarily verbal. It's more the dialogue hasn't occurred in some way yet. You know what I mean? And
my personal favourite is The Guardian.
Yeah, that seems to be quite a popular one, I must say. I guess The Guardian's a stab at a different kind of direction in some way in terms of the aesthetic and the world that he's in, and that is, I guess, it's more imaginary in some way, I can say. The figure itself is inspired by my dog that I used to have, Doberman Stash, and so it's not a kangaroo, it's not a deer, it's actually a dog. And the dog is dressed up in a hoodie, and he's kind of an urban character with big boots. He's a traveller, and he's carrying a backpack with a special tree that he's holding in the backpack, and he's looking for a place to plant it. And the idea is that it's the last tree on the planet, and that somewhat he's trying to find a special place for it. And he's got the ball in the center of his body, which signifies his energy. I guess he's a climate warning kind of figure that that's saying, we have to take care of the, species around us.
At least with, I think especially The Guardian,
and the passenger, there seems to be something a bit subversive about putting these sculptures in the middle of the city with this kind of message that is maybe contrary to the central business district kind of ethos. Do you think that?
I never really look at it in that way, to be honest, that it's meant to be, contrary to the ethos of... Look, I wouldn't really know what the ethos of the business district is in some way, if you kind of, ask me. I guess it's more on the personal level, the way I perceive city experiences and living in the city I think that public art can't just be a total kind of just a decorative aspect to supporting consumerism, if that's what you're saying. It has to have some sort of leg to stand on its own as a work in its own right. And it should comment on something that we all can relate to in some way or another, I think.
How much freedom are you given when you're given a spot to do, or do you have to apply first with what the artwork will be?
Usually there's a pretty confined brief on what the commissioning body wants, whether it's private or council. Private are a bit more open to suggestions and a bit braver, but when it, I guess, comes to council projects, they really tend to control what the final outcome of the work will be, and a lot of times the work becomes very diluted and becomes not what the artist intended a lot of time. I can't speak for everybody, but in my own experience of this process of being governed by all these different people in a way, the curators and the commissioners and people that are going to sort of maybe have to answer for it, tend to kind of get frightened and get worried about how the public's going to perceive it, or you can't just kind of confine artists in that way, that they can't sort of have a voice and try to commission something that's just going to be pretty and boring and just support, nothing really. It's a really restricting process a lot of the time, and I've stopped applying for a lot of the council projects because of that. Because all the work that has to go into proposals and all the design, and you're always trying to design it to the brief, so you're not really designing it to what you want to do a lot of the time. All
right. Thanks very much, Cezary.
All right. No worries. Pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Yes, we're talking Sculptors of Brisbane, right in the corner, sort of tucked away in the corner of King George Square. There's a former Premier of Queensland whose name I can't remember. It's not important. Politicians are all the same, Not quite. But next to him is Emma Miller, one of Brisbane's most famous trade unionists, radical activists. And I spoke to Jeff Rickertt, local Brisbane historian, about Emma Miller and about whether there are any other sculptures that portray important figures in Brisbane's radical history. Could you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name's Jeff Rickertt. I'm a Labor historian. I've been in Brisbane most of my life, and I've been working as a Labor historian here. And I've also been involved in the Labor movement and in various solidarity movements over the years.
Now, today we are talking about sculptures of Brisbane, and I'm interested in a couple of sculptures that are fairly significant figures in Brisbane's radical history. And the ones I'm thinking of particularly are Emma Miller, who's in King George Square brandishing her umbrella, and TJ Ryan, who is at Queen's Park in the corner there. Could you tell us a bit about these two people and what significance they have to our ideas of a radical Brisbane?
Sure. Well, Emma Miller, whose statue is in King George Square, she's one of the, in my opinion, the great figures of the Australian Labor movement, and certainly a fantastic figure in the Queensland Labor movement. So her period of activism spans a long period beginning in the 1890s, and she was born in England, but she migrated to Brisbane in 1879, and she was a seamstress by trade. In 1890, she helped to form a female workers' union in Brisbane, which mostly comprised tailoresses in shirt factories around the inner city area of Brisbane. She also went on to become a union organiser for the Australian Workers' Union in the 1890s. And she was the first woman member of Brisbane Workers' Political Organisation, which is what they used to call the Labor Party branches back in those days. She was also a champion of suffrage for women. She was the foundation president of the Women's Equal Franchise Association, which was a body set up mostly by working class Labor women to agitate for suffrage for women, but on the basis of one adult, one vote, which put them at odds with the middle class women in the suffrage movement who were satisfied to win voting rights for women simply on the basis of property rights. So Emma was on the Labor, on the working class side of that movement, and she actually lived to see women's suffrage enacted in Queensland in 1905. Emma's probably most famously known for an incident during the 1912 general strike when she was leading a large contingent of women to Parliament House, and the procession was attacked by police on foot and on horses. And she was only tiny physically, but she stood her ground against the police attack. And in one famous incident, she managed to dismount the police commissioner of the time, a guy called Cahill, allegedly using a pin from her hat, and he was thrown to the ground from his horse and injured. So, you know, she had a long, very important role in the political movements and the labour movements of Brisbane. And she was still active, though very old and frail. In 1916, during the first anti-conscription campaign, she was active in that. And she died in January 1917. So, as you mentioned, the statue in King George Square shows her brandishing an umbrella. She's in quite a defiant mood in the statue. She could be delivering a fiery speech, or she could be threatening the cops. It isn't quite clear, but it clearly shows her in a very defiant mood, and that seems to have been the nature of Emma Miller. She was an extraordinary fighter for the oppressed and workers.
And TJ Ryan, former Queensland Premier?
Yeah, well, TJ Ryan is also a figure from that era. So he was a lawyer originally, and then he became a politician. He entered Queensland Parliament in 1909, and then famously led the Labor Party to electoral victory in Queensland in 1915. And he headed a very reforming government in Queensland, introduced a lot of important changes, a lot of legislation that was of benefit to ordinary people, particularly working people. And then in the First World War, he played a very significant role in the anti-conscription campaign. In fact, he was considered really the national leader of the anti-conscription movement in Australia, and he went head-to-head with Billy Hughes, who was the Prime Minister at the time. Ryan left Queensland Parliament to pursue a career in the federal Parliament, but he actually died unexpectedly in 1921 at the age of 45, so that was a big blow to the Labor Party at the time. And the statue that you referred to is, as you said, in Queen's Park, and it was unveiled in 1925. Ted Theodore, who was Ryan's successor as Queensland's Labor Premier, established a committee to raise funds for the statue, and it was unveiled in 1925. And one of the things I particularly like about that statue, given Ryan's very public advocacy for Irish republicanism, was the fact that the statue is situated with Ryan's back facing towards the statue across the park, on the other side of the park, of Queen Victoria. So this is something that even the Courier Mail picked up on and whinged about in 1925, calling it an affront to the British Constitution because Ryan's back is turned to Queen Victoria. So yes, it's another a statue, a very important figure in Brisbane and Queensland's labour movement history.
Is there for honest poverty that hangs his heed and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that.
For all that and all that, our toil is obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gowd for all that. For all that and all that, their tinsel show and all that. The honest man, though e'er sae poor, is king of men for all that.
You see yon Burkie, called a lord, wha struts and stares and all that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that.
For all that and all that, his ribbon star and all that. The man of independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that.
A prince can mak a belted knight, a marquis, duke, and all that. But an honest man's aboon his might, good faith, he mauna for that.
Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will, for all that sense and worth o'er all the earth shall bear the gree and all that.
For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man, the world o'er, shall brothers be for all that.
That is the classic song by Robert Burns, or Rabbie Burns, as the Scottish would say. The poem is A Man's a Man for All That. Now, before that, I was speaking with Jeff Rickertt about some of the radical figures on Brisbane's streets. I had to chop it down a bit, edit a bit the interview, but we did go on after talking about TJ Ryan and Emma Miller to talk about what other radical figures there were. And he did mention Robert Burns, who there is a statue of in Centenary Place, sort of on the cusp of the city and the valley, there between Ann Street and Wickham Street. And he mentioned what I didn't know, even as an admirer of Robert Burns and of that statue, that the statue was actually erected by the Brisbane Burns Club, which was a very conservative, male-only organisation who were trying to kind of claim Robert Burns, Scotland's immortal bard, as it says on the plaque on the sculpture, trying to claim him for their own purposes. Of course, Robert Burns was very much a radical, supported the revolution in France and America, corresponded with radicals, and at one point was actually arrested and was possibly going to be trialed for treason or some kind of rebellion, and it was possibly only because he had so many rich benefactors who supported him that he got off. And so it's good that we can remember Robert Burns through poems like that, A Man's for Man for All That, quite a radical egalitarian message. And the Russian revolutionaries apparently actually loved Robert Burns, and other than Scotland, the place where there are most celebrations on Robert Burns' birthday, the 25th of January, is in Russia. And so, anyway, there's Robert Burns. You can go and look at his sculpture there. The other radical sculpture that I talked about with Jeff, which I've edited out, is of Eddie Gilbert, the legendary Aboriginal cricketer. He was the fifth Aboriginal Australian to play first-class cricket in the 1930s, and he certainly had the longest-lasting career of any up to that point. Although it was dogged by a controversy, he never went on a tour because there were worries about he wouldn't be allowed to stay in different hotels or things like that, being Aboriginal. There were concerns about his bowling action, and at one point he was refused to play in a game because at the Barrambar Mission, now known as Cherbourg, where he lived, there was some risk that there was leprosy, and so in a very racist act that he was left out of the Queensland team at that point because of the fear that people would catch a disease off him or something. But there's 2 sculptures dedicated to Eddie Gilbert in Brisbane. I don't know that there's many others of any other cricketers. There's a number of rugby league players around Lang Park. But one is at the Queensland Cricket headquarters in Albion. The other is outside the Gabba. There's a little collection of boomerangs and spears. It's an amazing story of Eddie Gilbert. And I did talk with Jeff about it, but I thought one of the best ways to tell it is this beautiful piece of writing from the early 1970s, written by cricket writer David Frith, who went on a quest to try to track down the legendary Aboriginal fast bowler Eddie Gilbert. And the quest took him to the Wollaston Park mental institution out between Brisbane and Ipswich there. And so he writes this about him. And I did get Triple Z music coordinator and avid sports fan Chris Cobcroft to read it for you all. So this is the article written by David Frith.
The Queensland Aboriginal cricketer Eddie Gilbert, famed for his bursts of express bowling during the 1930s, had not been heard of for so long that I took it upon myself, when in Brisbane, to track him down. An old-timer in the suburb of Red Hill, where Eddie was last seen, thought he'd died about 5 years before. We checked in the general store run by a cricket fan of some 60 summers. I'd just about swear to it. Old Eddie went right out of circulation and we never heard nothing of him for ages. I reckon he must have died 10 years back at least. They had him in Goodna for a while. I drove out to the psychiatric hospital along the Ipswich Road in the hope of establishing the truth of the matter. The superintendent, barely concealing his surprise at my questions, led me through to the records office where he produced Eddie Gilbert's hospital history card. Eddie was admitted on 8th December 1949. His age was shown as 37. I thought he would have been slightly older than that. Perhaps the paperwork was completed hastily that sad day. If you're writing about him, the superintendent volunteered, I can tell you a few things. He took 6 wickets in his last game for Queensland. Terrific bowler. I only ran half a dozen steps. He got the knack from boomerang throwing. Some reckon he chucked, but I never thought so. It was just his funny wrist action. Wish we had somebody like him right now. Some weeks earlier, Bill Hunt, the pre-war New South Wales player, had been in no doubt about it. Eddie threw me out. By cripes, yeah. And later on, I deliberately did the same to him. And you know what he said? I'll tell you. He put his arm round my shoulder and said, "Well bowled, Bill. That was a beauty." So you see, the little fella couldn't tell a bowl from a chuck anyway. Nice chap, bud. It was Hunt's contention that Stan McCabe, whose name will live for 3 classic test innings, himself considered his best hand to have been a 229 not out against Queensland at Brisbane in 1931, after Eddie Gilbert had served Don Bradman with the luckiest duck I ever made. The lithe black man that day, bowling with horrifying hostility on an underprepared pitch, had New South Wales in ribbons at 31 for 3, with Alan Kippax in hospital after a dreadful blow on the temple from a mishook off Thurlow. At that point, McCabe took command. So long ago, now here was I seeking to trace the conclusion of a life story. The superintendent glanced up from the history card. He was married at the time he came here. Nobody's visited him for ages. He used to be violent occasionally, but he's all right now. No trouble. But he's bottled right up within himself. You won't get him to talk. We've tried everything. He'll never change. Just as well, perhaps. If he went out again, he'd be back amongst the plonkies down at the Adelaide in no time. You're telling me he's here alive? He nodded. As I say, he's completely withdrawn. It's impossible to get through to him. He walks the grounds all day. He's content in his private world. We've tried to interest him in some kind of recreation. His reflexes are still sharp. But when we put a cricket ball in his hand, he just stared at it. It came as a shock. Eddie, still ticking after all. Even the locals had seemed so certain. I'd fallen into line with them and quietly and briefly mourned their popular hero of long ago, the fast bowler to whom they had bellowed encouragement to give Jardine a taste of his own bodyline medicine. In that Barumbar mob, David Forrest's amusing blend of fact and fantasy, Eddie had already been immortalised. On the top of Henry's Stulpnagel's head was imprinted in reverse, "Newfactured in Nostra," a living souvenir of a Gilbert bumper. When that ball hit the concrete, he exclaimed, "She'd smoke." Mr. Stulpnagel also knew why Eddie never became a test cricketer. He made an ape of Bradman, and he was black, and he was born in Queensland. And they didn't like the look of that whippy wrist of his. I made my reverent plea to the superintendent. I'd like to see Eddie. It's no use, he won't talk. I pressed him. I had to see the historic cricketer. He picked up the phone and asked the attendant at the appropriate wing to find Eddie. We walked across the sunlit lawns, past slumbering patients, small talk lost in the insistent buzz of insects. The coolness in the outer block was a relief. Eddie was some time in coming. Sitting in the office, I scanned the grounds through the open window. Suddenly, a male nurse was standing at the door, and behind him, reluctant to advance, was a thin man in a maroon t-shirt and black shorts. His hair was white and close-cropped, his skin glistening ebony. It was unmistakably Gilbert. He shuffled into the room, head to one side, eyes averted. Impossible to meet. His physique would have been insignificant beside Tom Richardson, Miller or Truman, yet he was not the midget legend as depicted. 5'8", with long arms, the devastating catapult machine he must once have been was apparent. "Shake hands, Eddie," his attendant urged kindly. The hand that had propelled the ball, that had smashed so many stumps, was raised slowly. It was as limp as a dislodged bale. He was muttering huskily and incoherently, gently rocking his head side to side. "Want a fag, Eddie?" the nurse asked softly. Eddie grunted, watched the cigarette begin to smoulder and puffed at it. His legs, typically of his race, were thin. He turned on them restlessly. He was an outdoor man. A room was a cage. When I asked the nurse if Eddie could write his name for me, he coaxed him to pick up the ballpoint. At the end of an agonising minute, Eddie backed away, leaving only a tortured E on the paper. His squinting eyes, deep set and bloodshot, flashed briefly across all of us. I thought then of what Archie Jackson, Australia's batting genius, had written about Eddie Gilbert in 1933. The adulation he has received has not affected his mental equilibrium. Such a player is an ornament to the game. May he continue to prosper. Eddie walked off, still breathing his wheezy monotone. He wandered through the meal hall, and the last I saw of him was as he drifted, a desolate individual, across the parched grass.
The story written by David Frith in, I think, 72 or something like that. He wrote that after finally meeting the elusive Eddie Gilbert in the Wollaston Park mental institution. Yes, we are talking Sculptures of Brisbane on the Paradigm Shift. We're here for another 10 minutes or so. I've got one more interview, which is with Luke Roberts, the creator of the UFO in West End sculpture, classic Brisbane sculpture, as well as more recently the Poinciana flower in Emma Miller Place. Luke Roberts is a very interesting person. Sadly, I'm going to have to savagely edit down the chat I had with him this morning too. But among other things, he is a gay rights activist. He has a character called Pope Alice who he acts as, and Pope Alice is queer in all kinds of ways. Here is Luke Roberts, Brisbane sculptor. Could you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, my name is Luke Roberts.
Now, Luke, today we are talking about Sculptures of Brisbane, and you did certainly one of the most discussed, I think, Sculptures of Brisbane, the UFO at West End. Can you tell us a bit about this artwork and the inspiration for it?
The area where it is was once rainforest, and the sculpture was part of the upgrade for that area for Melbourne Street in about 2003, and I proposed this sculpture as a UFO, but I made the acronym stand for Unclassified Flowering Organism rather than Unidentified Flying Object. But at the same time, it was meant to be a UFO in that I wanted to talk about immigration and migration and how West End had experienced a lot of different cultural groups in the area, particularly the Greeks in the 1950s, and then later the Vietnamese people and a whole lot of different groups now. I have an interest in UFOs and extraterrestrials, and so I was proposing this idea that we're not alone. Migration, immigration, refugees, etc., are going to manifest in all sorts of different ways into the future. So it was a positive expression of interest into the future, as well as to make people aware of those who aren't, that we aren't alone in the universe. But the title, as I said, Unclassified Flowering Organism, was also a way of recognising that there had been a very different environment there, a very different landscape there. Before West End was a suburb, before the Europeans came. So, of course, it was indicating that there had been other different civilizations, other different settlements, the Aboriginal people, of course. And who knows what else? I mean, perhaps there were even dinosaurs there. The shape of it is an unusual UFO, and it has a little bit of kind of a marine-like. At certain angles, it's a bit like a whale. It's a bit like a bird. So I was bringing all those things to play, so that it was. I'd like to think, curious, because I'm very much interested in the cabinet of curiosities, the unidentified elements of our universe.
So one thing I've never been completely clear on, is it all one, like the hanging silver flowers and the sort of lengths of pipe, is it all the one sculpture?
No. They were done by two other artists.
Yeah, I thought so, yeah.
Yes. So it is a bit confusing in that way. On the ground, underneath the UFO, it is a pattern in the concrete. I wanted it to be even more elaborate than it is, but if you look at it, you'll see that there's a shape, a geometric shape in the actual concrete, the area that the sculpture rests upon, and that's based on crop circles, designs. We don't seem to have them here in Australia, but particularly in the UK every year there's a lot of these amazing geometric shapes that appear in the crops, particularly now that they're experiencing a summer.
Have you received much feedback about the UFO? It seems like it's something that a lot of people talk about.
Yes, this is one of the strange things about our city, I think, is that you're telling me that it gets talked about a lot, and I'm glad to hear that. It's great that it is, no matter... that it's discussed. There had to be quite a bit of negotiation with the community over there before the council actually installed it, because there was concerns about the way in which West End was changing, and of course West End is continuing to change. And I appreciate the concerns, because it's a very valuable aspect of the city, and who wants it to be just sort of stomped on with huge apartment blocks, which is, they are encroaching on West End, and so a lot of the character of the place is changing. But this is one of the rare occasions that I've been asked to speak about it. I've never been asked to speak about it on air until today. When it first appeared, I was asked by the Courier Mail to talk about it, and they wrote something about it. So with the mainstream media or the even fringe media, I don't get asked about it. By the way, last year, another sculpture of mine opened in Emma Miller Place.
Yeah, that's the Poinciana flower.
Yeah, the poinsettia, which is the flower of Brisbane. And nothing has happened about that at all. One of the reasons for a certain kind of silence around it was that it was being built during the time of the council elections, and so I gather that public art isn't something that appeals to the public in regards to elections, and so they go quiet on these areas because it doesn't add to their votes. I gather they feel that it detracts from their votes, that people think it's a waste of money. But I don't think, from what I've had in terms of feedback, that that's the case. People have particularly love the Poinsettia River Fire. I've got so much positive feedback just from individuals, but once again, nothing from the media or the council even. In terms of the Lord Mayor's office, there's been no communication with me about it.
That is Luke Roberts there, renowned Brisbane sculptor. That interview sadly cut short by the constraints of time. If you dig around on the internet, on an old Paradigm Shift archive on SoundCloud, you can find the full version of that interview and the full version of the Jeff Rickertt interview, as well as the other interviews. And if you search for Sculptures of Brisbane zine by myself, Andy Payne, you can find that if you want to read other thoughts on the public art of our city. That concludes our little classic episode of the Paradigm Shift, and I'll go out with one final Brisbane sculpture. This one, the Witnessing to Silence sculpture made by Fiona Foley, which is on Roma Street, just out the back of the Brisbane Magistrates Court. It is an interesting sculpture made more interesting by the two separate plaques providing different artist statements, apparently because Fiona Foley got approval to make a sculpture in this setting of justice by saying it was about the ruggedness of the Australian bush and the resilience of people in the face of fire and flood. But after completing it, she revealed that it was really about the water and ash symbolising the massacres of Aboriginal people in this state, and she has written 94 different place names that were sites of massacres. A sad story, but also a tribute to Aboriginal people's survival and ingenuity in this case. That is all we have time for on our journey through the sculptures of Brisbane. I will see you next week.